Hey guys, we are going to talk about population and community ecology. This presentation is in two parts. This will be part one, part two, and part one will cover population ecology, and part two will cover community ecology. Let me apologize in advance. My nose is really stuffed up, so my voice is a little bit weird. Please stick with me. Thanks. Nature exists at several levels of complexity. This is a concept that you guys were first introduced to in biology when we talked to you guys about individuals comprising populations, populations comprising communities, communities comprising ecosystems, ecosystems comprising the biosphere. So this is that same concept. The individual is the simplest level of a natural ecosystem. Populations are made up of individuals of the same species that live in a given area at a specific time. That's actually, population is a very, very important concept in apes as it is in biology, that a population has to be the same species in the same area at the same time. And part of the reason this is an important concept is because evolution occurs at the level of a population. Populations live and interact together in communities. Community boundaries may be natural, meaning that maybe the community is something like a watering hole, or might be a waterlogged area in a small log or something like that, in a small fallen limb. But community boundaries can also be artificial, meaning that they're set by man. And we'll actually see examples of this in terms of national and state parks. Communities interact within ecosystems. Ecosystems consist of all the biotic and abiotic factors in an area. That should say factors, or I'm missing a word right there. All the biotic and abiotic factors in an area. Ecosystem ecologists study flows of energy and matter, such as the cycling of nutrients through an ecosystem. So when you're talking about ecosystem ecology, the people who study that are studying flows of energy and matter, and they're also studying the biogeochemical processes, the cycling of nutrients through that ecosystem. The biosphere incorporates all of Earth's ecosystems, kind of all put together. Scientists who study the biosphere are really looking at the movement of air, the movement of water, and the distribution of heat around the globe. It's a lot of what people who are trained in apes do. Populations have distinctive characteristics. Populations are dynamic. Individuals die. Individuals are born, or they're produced, depending on how that species reproduces. And individuals move from one population to another. So we're talking about births, we're talking about deaths, we're talking about immigration and emigration. Population ecology is the study of factors that cause populations to increase or to decrease. There are 5 basic characteristics of populations, and those are size, density, distribution, sex ratio, and age structure, and we're going to talk about each one of those. Population size, which is shown by a capital N, is the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. And that should say area, that says A-R-E, but it should say area right there. It should say area at a given time. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area, or unit volume if it's an aquatic ecosystem. So population size is just the raw number. Population density is that number per unit area. And that can be defined in any way that the researcher wants. It could be per square meter, it could be per square hectare, it could be by cubic meters if it's an aquatic ecosystem, but density has to have an area or a volume. Knowing a population size and its density can help scientists estimate whether a species is rare or abundant in an ecosystem. Knowing population density can also help determine whether a population can outstrip its food supply. This gets important when we're talking about ecosystem management. Population density is an important measure for wildlife managers who set hunting and fishing limits on species. Species are often divided into administrative management zones. So these would be artificial boundaries. And more hunting and fishing permits may be allowed in areas that have high population density versus those with low population density. So despite what the actual total population size is, some areas of an administrative boundary might have a larger proportion or a larger density of individuals, and you might issue more hunting or fishing permits for those areas and less in the areas where the species is more abundant. Population distribution is a description of how individuals are distributed with respect to one another. There are three main types of population distribution. They are random, uniform, and clumped. And again, you guys should be familiar. We teach this in regular bio, and of course, if you've had AP bio, you know all about this. In a random population distribution, individuals show no real distribution pattern. The individuals are kind of scattered randomly across the area. They don't seem to care whether or not they're close or far away from each other. This type of distribution pattern is the least common in nature. It is shown mostly by natural populations of plants whose seeds are dispersed by wind and water. And it is also less commonly shown by certain insect species. There are certain species of spiders that, for whatever reason, they are in a random distribution. They don't seem to care whether or not they're close to the other spiders of their same species or far away from them. In a uniform population distribution, individuals tend to be evenly distributed throughout an area. Uniform distribution is shown by territorial animals, by many types of birds in nesting areas, and among plants that either produce toxic chemicals, lots of trees. There are lots of species of trees that produce toxic chemicals from their roots. That's actually a way of plants competing with one another for scarce resources, and so they secrete these chemicals, and other plants of the same species cannot tolerate them and cannot live nearby. You also see this among cacti in deserts, because cacti have large root systems, very shallow root systems that spread out along the ground, and they're competing, of course, for water, and you will see uniform distribution among cacti in certain areas. In a clumped population distribution, individuals gather together around a resource, like a watering hole. They can gather for protection, or they might be gathering because of social hierarchies. But in any case, the individuals are clumped together in groups. Clumped population distribution is the most common type that we see in nature. It's shown by fish that swim in schools, schooling fish, birds that fly around and live in flocks, any type of herd type mammal. Humans are also clumped individuals. So we clump together in communities. Sometimes those communities are based around a resource, usually a river, usually a water resource. It could also be a food resource. But we also clump together for protection, and we clump together because of social hierarchies. It's just we are a social organism, and we show a clumped population distribution. Population sex ratio is the ratio of males to females in a population. In sexually reproducing species, they are generally close to 50-50, 50% male to 50% female. But they can be skewed in one direction or another for a certain species, and there's usually very specific reasons for that. Generally, the number of offspring produced is a function of how many females are in a population, because obviously the females are the childbearing of the species. So knowing a population's sex ratio helps scientists estimate the number of offspring that a population might produce in the next generation. Population age structure describes how many individuals fit into particular age categories within a population. Knowing a population's age structure can help ecologists predict how rapidly a population can grow or shrink, actually. Population with a large number of individuals past childbearing age, so that means that they're over the age of about 45, will not have a very high growth rate. Whereas a population with many individuals of reproductive age, or many individuals that are about to enter reproductive age, will have the potential to grow very rapidly. We're going to take a look at some age structure diagrams on the next slide. All right, so here's some generalized age structure diagrams. You are expected to know these on the AP exam. If you look down here at the bottom, you're going to see, hang on for just a sec, you're going to see the key down here. We have our pre-reproductive ages are 0 to 14, and they're coded in red on this particular graph. Reproductive age is 15 to 44. Post-reproductive age is 45 to 85. And there is our key right there. So rapidly expanding populations are going to look very much like a pyramid. And that's this one right here. These populations have many individuals that are entering the pre-reproductive stages. The base of this pyramid is very wide, and many in the reproductive ages of 15 to 44. You can see that there's a large base, and as these individuals in the red move up into the yellow, these populations will continue to grow rapidly. It also tapers off quite a bit when you get to the post-reproductive ages, because in a lot of these cases, these are characterized by developing countries who may not have fully modern medical systems. So we have a lot of young people, and you have a fewer number of the elderly. Just to make a note here, and we're going to cover this again when we cover human population demographics. The male cohorts are always on the left, the females are always on the right. And then usually there is a scale on the bottom, which this one does not have because these are generalized population age structures, but generally there's a scale on the bottom to tell you the relative numbers of people in the population. So examples of countries that are growing rapidly are Guatemala, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is not a developing country, but there's some other reasons why that's a rapidly expanding population, and that has to do with the social characteristics of that country. Some examples of countries that are expanding slowly are the United States, Australia, and China. And again, those are interesting case examples because they're expanding slowly for different reasons. And again, we're going to get more into this when we get into our next one. The United States is expanding slowly, largely due to immigration. The birth rate among Caucasian Americans has been quite low, lower than replacement rate for many years. But immigration keeps us expanding slowly. Australia has some other reasons that they're expanding slowly. They also permit immigration quite a bit. China, of course, is expanding slowly. They were expanding rapidly in the late 20th century, but the one-child policy has slowed them down quite a bit. And so they are now in the expanding slowly category. Stable, that's an interesting term, but stable means that the population is neither expanding nor declining. Japan, Italy, and Greece are shown here as stable. Japan has actually moved over here into the declining age structure diagram. At this point, we'll talk more about that again when we get a little bit further into this. This is just kind of generalized how to read them. Stable age structure diagrams tend to resemble more of a rectangle, and you can see that there are more individuals in the post-reproductive age here in the blue, and it becomes more like a rectangle. This is typical of countries that have gone through demographic transition, which is a term that you are not familiar with yet, and are in the postmodern phase. They also have very good access to, generally speaking, universal health care. Declining populations are ones where the proportion of individuals past childbearing age is actually larger than the individuals in the pre-reproductive or reproductive age, and you can see that here. The base of this pyramid is actually smaller than the top of the pyramid. So these types of societies have a greater number of elderly than they do people who are of reproductive age, which means that they also have less people in the workforce, and they have fewer young individuals. And as I said, Japan is actually a primary example of this. They've moved into the declining population age structure at this point. Population size is affected by density dependent and density independent factors. Density-dependent factors are factors that influence an individual's probability of survival and reproduction in a manner that depends on the size of the population. Predation rates and limiting resources are examples of density-dependent factors. A limiting resource is something that a population cannot live without and that occurs in quantities lower than the population would require to increase in size. Common limiting resources include obviously food, water, space. Space is for both plants, animals, microorganisms. Everybody needs space. Sunlight in the terms of photosynthetic organisms like plants. And soil nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and that would go again for plants, and aquatic photosynthesis as well. Now, I mentioned up here that predation rates, oops, I'm moving stuff around, that predation rates are actually right here, are actually a density-dependent factor. Predation rates go up the larger a prey population is. And the reason for that is when prey populations increase, they are actually easier for a predator to find, and they're larger. When they're larger, they're easier to catch. So predation rates would actually be a density-dependent factor as well. You may not have thought of it that way, just I wanted to mention it. Density-independent factors have the same effect on an individual's chance of survival and reproduction regardless of population size. So it doesn't matter what the size of a population is, density-independent factors will influence survival and reproduction no matter if the population is large or small. Density-independent factors tend to be abiotic factors, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, fires, volcanic eruption, prolonged or unseasonal freezes. These are things that will come and wipe out populations or affect the population's chance of survival and reproduction, and it doesn't matter what size the population is. It could be a small population, it could be a large population. These things come through and they wipe out populations or affect populations of large and small size equally without regard to the population size. Now, one thing to note is that if you do have a small population in an area and a density independent factor comes through, like a tornado or hurricane or whatever, obviously the smaller the population is, the more chance that it has of becoming very negatively impacted by something like a natural disaster, like a tornado, hurricane, flood, and they're more prone to extinction because of that. Population growth models. Population growth models are mathematical equations, mathematical models that can be used to predict population size at any given moment in time. Population growth rate is the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given period, minus the death of the individual, if that happens to occur, or its offspring during that same period. The intrinsic growth rate of a species, which we abbreviate as a lowercase r, is the growth rate under ideal conditions with unlimited resources available. The intrinsic growth rate is also called a species biotic potential. Now, this r that you're seeing here is the same little lowercase r that we have when we're talking about our selected species, and we're going to make that connection here in a minute when you see that. So again, intrinsic growth rate is under ideal conditions, meaning that that everything is wonderful and the environmental resources are stable and unlimited, which of course is most often not the case in the real world. So if we know the intrinsic growth rate of a population, which is R, and the number of reproducing individuals in the population, which is N sub naught, we can estimate the population's future size, which is N sub T, after some period of time has passed. This is known as the exponential growth model. In your book, you'll notice that they give you a equation for this, and they have some examples of how to calculate and kind of how to think about it. On the APES exam, you do not have to calculate exponential growth. You cannot do that without a calculator because it's a natural log function, and they do not ask you to do that. Now, understanding what the exponential growth model shows, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, that you do need to know. You just don't have to calculate it. When graphed, the exponential growth model produces a J-shaped curve. And here's that J-shaped curve. So notice that the x-axis is time and the y-axis is numbers. In a J-shaped curve, which is the graph of exponential growth, the growth rate at first is slow. And this is this part right in this area here. Of course, I'm using red over red, which is kind of dumb. But this area right here. So that growth rate right in that area is actually kind of slow because there's not many individuals reproducing. But as the population increases, there are more and more reproducing individuals. So the growth rate increases more and more. And that's what you're seeing here. Again, I'm using red over red, kind of dumb, but here we go. And that's that J that you see. The more individuals are reproducing, the quicker the growth rate increases, and you get that exponential J-shaped curve. Populations cannot experience exponential growth indefinitely because eventually resources run out, right? And conditions are not ideal. A growth model that takes into account limits on population growth due to limiting resources is called a logistic growth model. Excuse me. In a logistic growth model, the growth rate is initially exponential, but it slows as the population approaches the carrying capacity of the environment, and that is abbreviated by the capital letter K right there. And again, that is the same K that you see when we talk about Kselected species. So a logistic growth model produces an S-shaped curve. The carrying capacity is the maximum population size of a species that an environment can sustain indefinitely, given the food, habitat, water, and other necessities available in the environment. So here's an example of our S-shaped or our logistic growth curve. Again, time is on the x-axis and number of individuals or population is on the y-axis. The dotted line that you see right here is our K, our carrying capacity of the ecosystem. There it is. In an S-shaped curve, the graph of logistic growth, the early growth rate is rapid, and that's what you're seeing right here. The early growth rate is rapid, and it looks kind of like we're beginning a J curve here, right? But as we approach about half of the carrying capacity, so as we approach about right there, we begin to slow down. The growth rate begins to slow. As the population size nears the carrying capacity, the population starts growing and stops growing, and numbers stabilize with periodic oscillations around the carrying capacity. We're going to talk about those oscillations here in just a bit. But the population growth actually slows and we begin to stabilize. An assumption of the logistic growth model is that the number of offspring produced depends on the current population size and the carrying capacity of the environment. And those are valid assumptions. However, many species have specific seasonal mating periods, and the number of offspring that are produced also depends on the food supply at the time of mating. So for example, if there's a lot of food that is available at the time of mating, then you're going to have more organisms produced during that mating period. However, if the food supply during mating is more abundant than the food supply when the offspring are actually born, then the population will experience an overshoot because at that point it's now larger than the ecosystem's carrying capacity. There's a gestation time between mating and between the time that the individuals are born. And obviously it varies by species, but there is some type of gestation time. So again, if there is a disconnect between the amount of food that's available at mating and the amount of food that's available when those individuals are born, you're going to end up with a population overshoot where you've got more individuals than the ecosystem can sustain. Excuse me. As a result of the overshoot, there will not be enough food for all the individuals in the population, and the population will experience a die-off, which is a short-term rapid population decline due to death until the population achieves equilibrium with the carrying capacity again. And that's what you're seeing right here. And this is actually a graph straight out of your textbook. So we've got the J curve that you see right here that we've talked about before, right? And then we've got a population overshoot and a die back, a population overshoot and a die off, overshoot, die off, overshoot, die off. Now, hopefully, if we go on, those oscillations will actually become smaller. The overshoots will become smaller and the die-offs will become smaller until we tend to have minor oscillations around that carrying capacity. Predation plays an important role in limiting population growth. Populations of predator and prey species tend to oscillate around an equilibrium point. So this is a very famous graph, and you may have seen it before. The bluish line, or the teal colored line, is the population of snowshoe hare, which is shown here. These peaks are snowshoe hare right here. And then the red line is the lynx. Obviously, the snowshoe hare is the prey and the lynx is the predator. And you can see that there are predator-prey oscillations here. When the number of snowshoe hare go up right here, you see that initially the lynx population is low here and the snowshoe hare population is high. But as the lynx feed on the snowshoe hare, the lynx population comes up. Right? So there's a little bit of a lag time there. And then, of course, as the lynx population comes up and feeds on the snowshoe hare population comes down. Okay, and then, of course, as the snowshoe population comes down, the lynx population comes down. And then, of course, the snowshoe hare goes up again, and there's a little bit of a lag time, and the lynx comes up again. And we go up and down and up and down and up and down. There's always a lag time in the peak of the predator versus the peak of the prey. The population numbers of the prey are going to peak first because there's got to be prey for the predators to eat. And this is actually showing you that overshoot and die off kind of thing too. The lynx have a gestation period. So when the number of snowshoe hare are large, they eat those snowshoe hare and they mate and they produce a good crop of babies. But when the snowshoe hare, the number of those fall off, and there's fewer of them, when the babies are born, they don't have as much to eat. So we've got this population number, and there's a lag there in the peaks due to gestation time. Species have different reproductive strategies and distinct survivorship curves. You guys have actually done a survivorship curve at this point with our cemetery demographic data. So I told you we were going to see that Kselected, that K again. That K, of course, stands for carrying capacity. Kselected species are species that have a low intrinsic growth rate. That means that they are not growing rapidly. And this causes the population to increase slowly until it reaches the carrying capacity of the environment. The abundance of a Kselected species is determined by the carrying capacity of the environment, and population fluctuations are generally small. Kselected species have certain traits in common. They're typically large. They typically reach reproductive maturity rather late. They produce few large offspring, usually one or two. They don't produce lots of litters. And they provide substantial parental care to their few large offspring. When you invest a lot of metabolic resources into creating a large offspring and you only do that once in a while, then there's a lot of parental care that's also invested in those offspring. These species also tend to be niche specialists, meaning they have specific biotic and abiotic needs that they must obtain from their environment. These characteristics mean that Kselected species are often prone to extinction as they cannot respond quickly to environmental change. Opposite of Kselected species are R-selected species, and these guys have a high intrinsic growth rate that often leads to population overshoots and die-offs. So these guys are growing rapidly, and again, that lowercase r actually refers to the intrinsic growth rate that we talked about before. R-selected species reproduce often. They produce large numbers of offspring, so litters, or in the case of insects, thousands of eggs. Typically experience exponential growth followed by offshoots and die-offs, and you saw that in the graph that we talked about previously. These guys tend to be small. They reach reproductive maturity quickly, and they're often characterized as pest species like cockroaches, dandelions, and mice. Part of the reason that we call them pests is because they're always around, right? They're getting into everything. They are niche generalists, and I didn't actually put that on there, but I'm going to put that out there. They tend to be niche generalists. In contrast to Kselected species, which are niche specialists. These guys can live pretty much anywhere, and they have a wide range of biotic and abiotic factors that, that they're comfortable living under. Most species fall somewhere between the two extremes of purely Kselected and purely R-selected. And many species exhibit combinations of traits between the two that are somewhere between these two extremes. Species have distinct patterns of survival over the lifespan of individuals. These patterns are called survivorship curves, and there are 3 basic types of survivorship curves. Type 1 has a high survival throughout most of the lifespan, but then individuals start to die off in large numbers as they reach old age. This is usually true of Kselected species, and humans are also type 1 survivorship curve. And you guys should have seen that when we were when you were mapping the cemetery data. I believe it was on the cemetery the data sheet there. So I'm going to actually just draw this in because I'm not quite sure why I didn't put it in here to begin with. Just going to draw this in, and I'm going to draw this as we talk about all 3. So if we were talking about type 1 survivorship curve, it generally looks like this, right? So the bottom here would be age, and the Y curve would be survivorship, and that's a logarithmic scale. I'm just going to write this down here. Survivors. Wow, that looks bad. Survivors. I'm just short for survivorship. So we've got age and survivors. So this would be our type 1. Okay. And that's, again, high survival throughout most of the lifespan, but then the individuals begin to die in large numbers as they reach old age. Type 1. And then type 2 is a relatively constant decline in survivorship. It tends to be kind of a straight line that goes like this. Examples of this include corals, squirrels, dogs and cats, actually. Domestic dogs and cats show a type 2 survivorship curve where the rate of loss, the rate of death, is relatively constant throughout the lifespan of the individuals. Type 3 survivorship curve is the inverse. It's the opposite of type 1, so it looks kind of like this. This is 2, and then this is 3. Okay. The type 3 survivorship curve is characterized by very low survivorship early in life, meaning that lots and lots of juvenile and infant individuals die, and very few reach adulthood. These are usually R-selected species. They're species that produce many, many young. They're often species that do like egg laying, or what they call broadcast reproduction, where the female kind of lays eggs in an area and the male will just broadcast sperm over them. Amphibians do this. Lots of plant species do this. Fish do this. So a lot of the reason that they have to do that is because many of those organisms do not survive. In fact, they don't even get out of the egg or the juvenile stage. Interconnected populations form what we call metapopulations, and this is probably a new term for you. A metapopulation is a group of spatially distinct populations, meaning that they're actually separated in some way or another, that are connected by occasional movements of individuals between them, which keeps up their genetic diversity. The individuals that move often use strips of natural habitat that we call corridors, habitat corridors, to move between these metapopulations. The degree of connectedness between these metapopulations determines their ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions and therefore their vulnerability to extinction. And of course, if the habitat corridor is in some way destroyed or it's blocked, then we end up with isolated populations that are prone to interbreeding. And that's what we were talking about in this next part. Metapopulations are already prone to what they call inbreeding depression because they are geographically or spatially distinct and they're isolated from one another. And again, if the habitat corridors where the individuals that are going back and forth between these metapopulations, if they're somehow blocked, then the populations begin to interbreed. They begin to breed within themselves. When that happens, these individuals with similar genotypes begin to produce offspring that have an impaired ability to survive and reproduce. Inbreeding leads to the expression of generally negative recessive traits, and so we end up with individuals with odd, maladaptive or non-adaptive traits. However, metapopulations can also protect populations against threats such as diseases, since populations that are relatively isolated from one another, if the disease carriers are limited there because you've only got a few organisms that are actually using these habitat corridors to go back and forth between these populations. So, for instance, if one population it perishes or is wiped out from a disease, if the organism that was going back and forth between that population and the other population is wiped out, if that disease vector is wiped out, then the other metapopulations of that species would be able to survive and not be succumb to the disease.